Okay, everyone, today we're going to go over Standard 6. Standard 6 gets into the 1920s and the Great Depression. So in the 1920s, we do see a booming economy. The U.S. experienced unprecedented economic growth during the 1920s, but not everyone shared in that prosperity, and there was a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. So basically, we're seeing kind of an unequal or uneven distribution of wealth and income. So the losers of this economic boom are going to be the farmers, and laborers. So farmers are losing in this because of low crop prices. Overproduction of agricultural goods have led to a dramatic decrease in prices, and because of that, farmers aren't seeing the profits that they had earlier. Okay, laborers, their wages aren't growing very quickly because of an anti-union sentiment during the time period. Okay, so some of the causes of this boom, we've got mass production being one of those. Henry Ford's assembly line made production more efficient but cut out the need for skilled laborers. Automobiles became prevalent during the 1920s because of Ford's assembly line. Many other products such as radios and refrigerators were mass-produced on assembly lines as well. Okay, household appliances and consumer culture. New electric appliances such as the vacuum cleaner, iron, and washing machine made it easier than ever for housewives to do household chores. This led to things like an increase in leisure time. Okay, advertising, mass market advertising is also going to grow, and they're going to be advertising a new way to pay for goods. Buy now, pay later through the installment plan. So Americans who couldn't afford the new appliances purchased them on the installment plan, where you would pay a little at a time, a little down, and then a little bit at a time. And of course, that put people into debt. All right, so African Americans in the 1920s, we see the Great Migration. Black Americans leave the South to search for jobs and escape lynching and other forms of racism in the South. So they're leaving the South and going to the North and out West. We see jazz music become popular. Black musicians played for white audiences, leading to some cultural exchange. And some of that is part of the Harlem Renaissance, an African-American artistic and literary movement, and one of the famous writers of that movement was Langston Hughes. Okay. We also see the advent of and popularity of film, but we also see a lot of stereotyping in film. So an example of this would be Birth of a Nation. Popular film promoted racial stereotypes and made the KKK appear heroic. So still a lot of racial tension going on. Okay, the role of women is starting to change. Although women could vote in the 1920s thanks to the passage of the 19th Amendment, women made little impact on politics, typically voting the same way as their husbands did. Many young women known as flappers challenged cultural norms of ladylike behavior. Flappers could be identified by their short hair, knee-length skirts, and their permissive lifestyles. Flapper culture had very little impact on women as a whole, as most women either stayed at home and made use of their new electrical appliances or worked menial jobs where they were paid less than men. We also see an increase in nativism in the 1920s, and nativism has to do with xenophobia, or a fear of foreigners and immigrants. American nativism reached a new peak in the 1920s due to the effects of World War I propaganda and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. The Bolsheviks were the communists in Russia in 1917. This political cartoon showcases American fears that many of the new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were communists, socialists, or anarchists. So with this, we have the first Red Scare, or fear of communism, or a communist takeover of the United States. In response to these, the government has the Palmer raids, where the government is raiding people's homes, and they arrest 4,000 alleged communists, many of whom are immigrants, and many of whom were deported. Also, we have the Immigration Quota Acts, placed quotas on immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Okay, so basically, they put limits on how many immigrants from those places could come to the United States. And these limits were far less in countries from Southern and Eastern Europe than they were on Western immigrants. We see the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. 2 Italian immigrants were found guilty of murder and executed based on questionable evidence of guilt. So we see that discrimination against both immigrants from Italy, but as well as discrimination against anarchists. The 2 were anarchists. All right, Prohibition happens during the 20s into the 30s, so it's originating from the temperance movement from the antebellum period. Prohibition gained traction during World War I due to anti-German sentiment and the wartime push to conserve grain, the primary ingredient in beer and liquor. So with this, we get the 18th Amendment, ban the sale and consumption of intoxicating liquors. The enforcement of this is unsuccessful because we have bootleggers, illegal alcohol sellers like Al Capone, for example, and speakeasies. These are the private clubs where alcohol was consumed illegally. And this bootlegging and the running of speakeasies, it leads to a rise in organized crime and sort of this new gang versus gang and gang versus the federal government in alcohol. So because of the failure of Prohibition, we get the 21st Amendment, which repealed the 18th, okay, in 1933. Okay, so we talked about how the that racist tension was still going on. We have a revival of the KKK, nativist sentiment, and the successes of the film Birth of a Nation laid the groundwork for a revival of the Ku Klux Klan. Members of the second KKK cast themselves as the guardians of 100% Americans. Okay, so true Americans, they claimed, were white, native born, meaning born in the United States, and Protestant, so not Catholic, not Jewish. Un-American would be black or brown, basically anything other than white. Foreign born, and Catholic or Jewish. Okay. So the Klan considered anyone un-American who did not fit the WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant profile. Note that while the Klan was a white supremacist organization, it also targeted immigrants and religious minorities. Klan members, this photo here is a march on Washington in the 1920s. So moral watchdog, the Klan also supported Prohibition, opposed bootlegging and gambling, and held its members of high moral standards. This function of the Klan was undermined by scandals involving its members in the late 1920s and early 1930s. The Klan's membership exceeded 4 million in the 1920s, and the organization was stronger in the Midwest. so Indiana, Ohio, states like that, than it was in the South. So it wasn't just a southern thing, it was nationwide. Okay, the Scopes monkey trial. So with the Scopes trial, which was nicknamed the monkey trial by journalists covering it, basically we get a conflict between religious conservatives and science. So the question here, how do we explain the origins of humanity? So we've got religious fundamentalists, all right, which are conservative. They, of course, use the Bible to do that, all right? So the Bible contains the literal and true account of creation by God versus modern science, which was seen as kind of the more liberal. So we've got Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution explaining that. So in 1925, the Tennessee legislature passed a law forbidding the teaching of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution in schools. John Scopes, a substitute teacher and football coach, taught a lesson on evolution so that the town of Dayton, Tennessee, could host a trial. The trial received national media coverage. William Jennings Bryan, a fundamentalist, volunteered to prosecute the case against Scopes. Scopes was defended by an attorney from the American Civil Liberties Union. Okay. So 6.3, we're getting into the Great Depression now. So causes of the Great Depression: consumers bought goods on credit during the 1920s, and most Americans were heavily indebted by the end of the decade. So we have this large amount of debt weighing on the economy. So factors contributing to consumer debt: the Roaring '20s easy money policy. So that whole type of living in the 20s certainly added to that. So during the 1920s, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates low, which encouraged borrowing. After the stock market crashed, the Fed suddenly tightened the money supply. Also, overconsumption: consumers borrowed money to pay for new appliances and other consumer goods, purchasing these items on the installment plan. So we also have stock market speculation. So speculation is risky investing. Okay, and one of the worst parts of that was buying on the margin. So borrowing money in order to pay for stocks, which is not smart at all. By the late 1920s, consumers had so much debt that they could no longer pay for expensive consumer goods, which lowered demand. This resulted in overproduction, resulting in decreased profits for companies. Okay, and that's going to cause the stock market to dip, and then people will start trying to sell off their stocks as quickly as they can, and that leads to the stock market crash in 1929. So with that, we also see the farm economy collapsing due to both economic issues as well as environmental issues like the Dust Bowl. So we have the Okies in Oklahoma migrating to California to look for work, which they could not find. Unemployment was up to 25%. Okay, President Herbert Hoover tried unsuccessfully to help. He increased taxes, which didn't help at all, and the Hawley-Smoot tariff, he put in place a protective tariff. All right, both of these things actually made the Depression worse. So Hoover rejected the idea of direct relief to the poor. Basically, that would be the government giving financial aid to the poor. He believed in rugged individualism. Okay, so Hoovervilles. So Hoovervilles became a symbol of most Americans' lack of confidence in Hoover's leadership, these kind of shanty towns that were put up from people who lost their homes. In 1932, a group of World War I veterans known as the Bonus Army marched on Washington to demand an early payment of their bonus or veterans' pensions that were due to be paid in 1945. The U.S. Army attacked the bonus army with cavalry, tanks, and gas, furthering the impression that Hoover was callous toward those who were suffering during the Depression. So once again, Hoover's not getting any more popular. So in comes FDR. So we get the New Deal with Franklin D. Roosevelt, elected in 1932. Okay, his wife, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. So the 3 R's of the New Deal, that would be relief, providing relief, recovery, fixing the economy, recovering it, and then reform, passing laws and regulation that would hopefully prevent it from happening again. So were they successful? Well, relief was partially successful. So yes, he was able to provide some relief to Americans. Recovery, no. The New Deal, this is important, the New Deal does not solve the Great Depression. It doesn't end the Great Depression, okay? World War II does that. Reform, yes, he does reform, especially the banking system, the finance systems, to help prevent future crises like this from happening again. So in his inaugural address, he is famous for saying, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, kind of in referencing to the bank runs that had made the Depression worse. So FDR addressed panic by declaring a bank holiday, so the banks were closed, and used fireside chats, radio addresses that he used to explain his plans to the people in plain language. Okay, so FDR's alphabet soup, this deals with the New Deal agencies created by his administration. So we've got the FDIC, that would be the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. All right, and what it did is it insured bank deposits. So the money in your accounts, they were insured by the government. So if the bank collapsed, a portion of your money would be guaranteed to be paid back to you. Okay, the AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the purpose here would be to pay farmers, so these are farm subsidies, pay farmers to not grow. All right, so this was supposed to fix overproduction. Okay, the NRA, National Recovery Administration, the purpose here was to create fair practices and set prices. Both of these, by the way, were deemed unconstitutional or ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. All right, the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission. All right, its purpose was to monitor and regulate the stock market. Okay, the TVA, or the Tennessee Valley Authority. All right, its purpose was to provide jobs and cheap electricity. Okay, the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, provide temporary jobs to single males. Okay. SSA, Social Security Administration. This purpose was provide income to the elderly. And finally, the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, was supposed to help unions and enforce labor laws. Okay. So all of these programs were supposed to help FDR accomplish those 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. All right, criticisms of the New Deal. From the left, the main argument was that it did not do enough, did not go far enough. And then, of course, from the right, it says went too far, right? The exact opposite. And basically, they were citing too much dependence on the government. That the president and the federal government, well, they were overstepping their bounds. Okay, so the Supreme Court in the New Deal, in Schechter versus the United States, the Supreme Court declared the National Recovery Act unconstitutional. This is an example of judicial review. A principle established by John Marshall in Marbury versus Madison. Okay, in response to the Supreme Court's ruling, FDR presented a plan to Congress to expand the Supreme Court, which would have allowed the president to appoint more justices to the court. This plan undermined the system of checks and balances that are enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. Congress rejected the court-packing plan, handing FDR his first major legislative defeat. All right, African Americans in the New Deal. African American workers were typically the last hired and the first fired, leading to black workers suffering from a much higher level of unemployment, around 50%, than whites, 25%. Although FDR took little official action to combat racial discrimination, black voters began to align themselves with Roosevelt's Democratic Party in the 1930s. Before the New Deal, African American voters had typically supported the Republican Party. The New Deal did not bring about economic recovery in the 1930s. However, the New Deal did provide relief for people who were suffering during the Depression. And that wraps up Standard 6. Hope this helps. I'll see you next time with Standard 7.